from the report is that we are starting to take this idea seriously, because it's been far too long since we haven't looked at the taxation of land. And that's obviously for loads of institutional reasons, because of the role that land has played in the Scottish economy and Scottish society for 350 years. It's always the last thing to be looked at, because it's land that's held by the wealthiest in society, and we tend to be scared of doing anything about it. So I think the work that you've both done is really, really important. And I hope that we get a little bit of traction, because it's, 1991, come on.
Yeah,
and not
it is a very long
underlying
time.
value of land is just crazy.
Yeah.
Well, today we're talking about something that quietly shapes almost everything in Scotland's economy: how we value land. From housing and agriculture to renewable energy and natural capital, the way we decide what land is worth influences who owns it, how it's used, and who benefits from it. Yet despite its impact, land valuation often happens behind the scenes, guided by methods that most of us never see. To explore this, the Scottish Land Commission asked WPI Economics to produce a report titled Approaches to Land Valuation, and that's what we're going to look at in detail today. Now, joining me to unpack the findings are Cathy Pollard, Head of Policy at the Scottish Land Commission, who I actually bumped into at the tax conference a while ago, 2 weeks ago I think it was, and Matt Beebe, Senior Consultant at WPI Economics and one of the report's authors. Welcome to you both.
Hi there.
Hi, William. Nice to meet you.
Well, before we get into the details, let's start with the basics. When we talk about land valuation, what do we really mean, and why does it matter so much for Scotland?
Great question to start off with. So let's just start at the very beginning. If Scottish ministers, or if Scotland wants to make more use of land and property in the tax system and make full use of its powers, it's really important that we actually understand on what basis that's taxed. So, what does the tax infrastructure and system look like? If we're really keen to open up the choice for governments, then actually land valuation really matters.
Okay, so it's land valuation principally to understand its value so we can tax it?
Exactly. It's complicated. There are different methods and approaches, as Matt will probably cover in a minute. But I think understanding just on what basis tax policy is made is really key.
And why do you think that matters so much for Scotland now?
I think there's a desire, as we've seen in the Scottish Government's tax strategy and budget commitments, to increase the role that land and property can play in the tax system. So there's a commitment to look at longer term sustainable tax revenues. So I think it's important that we actually understand what role land can play within that, but also understanding the impact tax can have on changing behaviours, so supporting climate change outcomes, land reform objectives. I think we just need to start from basic principles, and how you actually value that is a really key part of that.
Yeah, I think it's worth just adding, I think as sort of Cathy said, it's starting from the basics, but it's actually quite a complicated sort of basics to sort of work from. There are varying ways to estimate sort of what the value of land and property sort of actually is. Do you separate the buildings and the infrastructure that's on it from that valuation? Do you do them separately? Do you do it combined? There's no one real sort of understanding of what land and property even means sort of internationally. There are sort of different interpretations there. So if you're sort of looking at sort of good practice, it's in some ways quite hard, because there are just sort of variations in the basics there, and sort of lots of sort of different ways that you can sort of look at this. There are guiding principles, but yeah, there's lots of variation across jurisdictions, and also types of land and property to obviously have some sort of novel features, which we can obviously come and talk to more shortly.
Yeah. So in summary there, the Scottish Government is keen to investigate how we can tax land. I think I can be as bold to say how we can tax land at a higher level, as well as looking to how we do it differently to kind of make a more progressive taxation system, and land is right at the heart of that. So if that's what they want to do, how are we currently valuing land and property in Scotland? Why do we need to be looking at these other countries to see if they do it better?
So I think it's actually fair to say that in terms of in terms of for the purpose of taxation, Scotland doesn't actually really tax land, and that's not sort of unique to Scotland. That's also in parts of other the UK too. There isn't really sort of a land tax, as I think probably most people would understand that. In terms of for the purpose of taxation of property, that's currently done in Scotland in sort of two sort of primary ways. That's on obviously residential and domestic property, commercial property. Sorry. These two things are taxed and valued separately. There's a different system for valuing those. That's not sort of unique or different. That's just a choice that's sort of been made.
And that's the same as the UK, isn't it? More generally, the
yeah,
UK.
Yeah.
Because
the interesting
pre-devolution, when we go to like 1991 and we talk about the revaluation of council tax, this is pre-devolution. This is pre-Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. There's no sort of major sort of deviation really. Where Scotland is actually quite unique in its approach to valuation. Compared to England and Wales, is that this is done relatively locally. It's done by sort of local assessors who are sort of overseen or supported by the Scottish Assessors Association. In England and Wales, the process is actually done sort of at a national sort of level by the valuation sort of office. So sort of Scotland is sort of relatively unique there. That there are sort of local assessors who do this. There are different way. Broadly speaking, commercial and residential and property are valued in the same way using comparative principles. There are other things that are done in the residential space too, and the commercial space as well to account for slightly different types of commercial property. But I think, as you alluded to, the largest difference between residential and commercial property is how often it is revalued. Residential property is not revalued. It's fixed at a moment in time. It's valued based on data from 1991, whereas commercial property is revalued every 3 years.
Were either of you born when the council tax when our homes were actually valued? That's a rhetorical question. You don't need to answer that. I know I was at the tax session down the tax event down in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago, Kathy, when you were there, and Ross Greer, who's the co-leader of the Green Party in Scotland, said I wasn't even born. And we're still looking at the value of properties before I was even born. And just that kind of statement makes you see how ludicrous it is.
About sort of why we're looking at this as well. I think that there is a lot that Scottish Government could do in this space. There are lots of devolved taxes. There's a real opportunity to think a bit differently about the role of land in the economy and the tax system. And one of the things the Land Commission has called for previously, we provided advice to Scottish ministers in 2022, was to bring all land onto the valuation roll. So currently there are certain land types that are exempt. Yeah. And so if you want to use it as a lever to deliver on climate change, net zero, and support the economy, actually we need to sort of think about the land system as a whole, and not necessarily exempt any different land types. So yeah, it's about having that lever as a future flex, I suppose.
Yeah. What type of land is not accounted for in terms of its valuation?
So agriculture, for example, and forestry. I mean, it is taxed in different ways. It's just the actual land, the sort of foundation of that. And as the research explores, it's not necessarily a valuation role, but it's understanding the basis. Where is this data held and how are decisions made? I suppose that's what we tried to get to with this report.
And then before we move on, just a little bit of a summary of the concerns. So obviously we're looking at how land and property, extensively land, is valued and taxed. What are the concerns that the Land Commission has, and also what the concerns from Scottish ministers as well? Just a kind of summary of that.
I think that's a difficult one to answer because I think the system is currently sort of working the way it sort of always has done, but I think there is much more that it could be doing. I think that's the point, is that there's a huge opportunity and potential to think a bit differently about this. Cost of living, current economic context, we need to really rethink how how we're using all the different mechanisms. I mean, just going back to where some of this work started, Scottish Government has committed to working with us in the 2025 to 26 budget to explore options for a carbon land tax, as well as how tax can play a role to support land reform outcomes. And I think a key emerging finding from this so far is that while it makes sense to look at specific mechanisms like a carbon land tax, is actually probably quite helpful to see the system as a whole and understand the opportunity in a sort of longer term, which is why we need to sort of lift the bonnet and look at the nuts and bolts that make up our tax system. And again, this is where this report has been really helpful in just illuminating sort of key considerations, a framework for building a tax system that can do more and deliver more. But
Brilliant.
one of the key things that I just want to flag at this point is that there needs to be more work done. This is just the beginning of a longer term conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice report, and I would say that anyone could read it. It's really interesting to see how other countries manage land. It's not overly technical. At the end of it, you've got a real good understanding that people do things differently. And I would say maybe we'll get towards at the end, but you could certainly look at Scotland and you can kind of put it in the unique. There's a lot of things that we do that are unique compared to everyone else. And I think you always kind of need to take a step back and say, when you're doing something different from everyone, that's either a brilliant idea or a terrible idea. So let's dig into that in a little bit more detail. Before we move into the report, Kathy, how does this report align with the other work that the Scottish Land Commission is doing? Because I know you've got like a wider strategy around responsible land use and ownership. Does this fit squarely with that, or is it a little bit to the side?
No, absolutely. And it builds on the Land Reform Review Group recommendations as well. This is very much about understanding all the different mechanisms. We look at policy and practice and driving land reform. So this is ensuring that the way land is used, owned and managed benefits people, the public, and local places. So I think, tax is a really important lever for delivering the kinds of outcomes we want to see, not only in shaping behaviour, but also raising revenue. So I think, unlocking sort of the potential of, say, derelict land, and we have a pretty significant work stream on vacant and derelict land, for example, through taxation, is something that we're really keen to explore.
You looked at 4 countries, didn't you, as your kind of, I'm not sure if they were best case or you were just kind of looking for something different, but you looked at Australia, the Netherlands, Denmark and New Zealand. So why did you choose, Matt, and I think that would have been down to you in writing the report, why did you choose those 4 countries?
We had some steer from the Scottish Land Commission to start with, previous work that they had commissioned and undertaken. So it was sort of building on previous work too. These were sort of established places that I think, as you sort of say, do have elements of good practice. I wouldn't say sort of exclusively. I think there are things that can be drawn from sort of all of them that are both good and bad, I suppose. We were drawing on sort of previous work. I think they gave us quite a nice geographical spread. We had sort of two in Europe. We then had Australia, and we also had sort of South Africa as well, which is a really interesting sort of place to sort of look at. As I said, they sort of showcase a variety of contrasting approaches to valuing land, and we can sort of get into that sort of more too. So there's some sort of interesting sort of novelties there. And also they've all had sort of challenges in terms of implementing or moving forward their sort of valuation sort of system too. So there's sort of scope for sort of the sort of Scottish government, sort of Scottish ministers to sort of learn from those sort of challenges and sort of move things forward too. So I think they gave a nice spread of breadth and lessons.
I mean, when you're looking at Denmark's quite often one of the countries that Scotland's compared to, because it's round about the same population size, and it's a relatively wealthy country like ours. It's similar to New Zealand. Again, a lot of comparisons to that. But it was interesting to see Australia, which is obviously this ginormous country, and the Netherlands, which is a good bit larger than Scotland, and obviously geographically very different as well. So I think it is interesting to see those 4 different countries looked at. Well, let's get into the details then. What are the headline findings? So I'm just kind of looking for something where I can, if someone's only going to spend a couple of minutes looking at this interview, what are the headlines? What are the takeaways for them?
To be sort of brash with it, I think our framework is quite good. I think we sort of set out quite a good sort of framework. That's sort of towards the end of the report, so we'll have to be going into sort of more detail on sort of each of the countries. I think when we start to draw up the comparative, we sort of set out a framework around sort of 6 sort of key areas that should make up a valuation sort of system. Sort of these are probably the 6 things you sort of want to be looking at, and they range from sort of on what a basis are you valuing land or property, what are the key actors that are involved, what data you're using, what are your methods, how often are you valuing, and how are you considering the natural environment, which is an increasing cause for concern. And we sort of set out a framework of sort of what good should sort of look like in those areas, and sort of did sort of a diagrammatic scale of sort of where the 4 countries and sort of Scotland we sort of looked at are placed. So I think a sort of a quick way for sort of someone to really sort of understand the issue. I think that's sort of a main sort of takeaway there. Happy to dive into sort of any of those areas and just sort of draw out the key conclusions. But I think as a sort of overarching sort of structural thing, I think I think that was sort of really good and sort of really helpful, and hopefully helpful for the conversations that are to come from the work.
Yeah.
A couple of really sort of key takeaways. As Matt says, there's a really useful practical framework that we can take away and consider as part of our work going forward. But also, I think the role of data, going back to data again, but the role of data and ensuring that you've got a system that coordinates data, that there's transparency and trust in the valuation approach to support tax decisions. That's really key. And the other thing is about, I suppose, engaging the public, and when there are any changes to the tax system, that you are bringing people along with you. And that totally echoes our previous work in this space on sort of potential for land value taxation. So I think that's really key, is that there is sort of that strong connection to the public, and bringing people along with you.
I think there are 2 key examples that really highlight the importance of that trust and sort of change in system, and the ones in Denmark and the ones in Netherlands. In Denmark, they moved relatively recently to essentially a completely automated sort of system of doing this. Sort of all sort of human oversight was sort of taken out of the process. They have really good sort of national sort of data sets that they're able to sort of draw on. That all sounds great in theory. However, there were a few snags, shall we say, in terms of the values that were sort of being sort of churned out, and there was considerable sort of public angst here. So it was just a case where the theoretical benefits of sort of moving to a highly advanced sort of system sort of did have drawbacks, and the Danish have now had to sort of rail back a little bit, and there's now more sort of human sort of quality assurance sort of added in. But the sort of grounding of that is the importance of trust, that they want to maintain this sort of trust, that people trust that the system, the values they're getting are right and accurate. And the same thing, or a similar sort of situation happened in the Netherlands. I think in 2021, the Netherlands does its valuations every year. The 2021 valuation saw a considerable spike for a number of sort of factors. There was a lot sort of going on, obviously, at that time. So valuation sort of peaked. This again caused some issues and sort of public angst. There was then sort of a conversation around moving to a 2-year sort of system of sort of valuation, but the sort of the Dutch oversight organisation that sort of oversees valuations was quite sort of steadfast and strong that this sort of valuation process is important for trust. Okay, we might see some fluctuations every now and then, but that's sort of part of the process, and we just have to sort of go with that. But this sort of annual process is really important for trust. People are having this sort of regular updates, and there might be some issues with that, but it's really important. So trust is at the hallmark of this sort of system. Otherwise, it doesn't work, and you don't have buy-in, and people aren't going to pay the tax, or there's going to be a lot of sort of objections to valuation. So it's really key.
And perfect system doesn't exist.
Yes,
and it's very much driven by the local context and conditions as well. So it's a long-term process. It's not something we can just simply fix overnight. So I think that's another really important takeaway.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say I agree with you completely, but it was 1991 when we did this. So it's probably about time that we get moving on doing it. And I know there's no commitment, and there's unlikely to be any commitment in any of the political parties that they're going to tackle this in the next parliamentary term to a large degree. Hopefully the Land Commission can have some input into that. But it's just a final clarification point I wanted just to confirm for the listeners. When we're looking at property and land in Scotland, we haven't revalued property, domestic or residential property, since 1991. Okay, and most people would know that. But what happens with commercial property? How often is that valued at the moment?
So that's every 3 years, although that cycle I think has only just started. There was a review done in 2017, I think it was, that sort of looked at the broader sort of rates system for commercial property, and that was sort of one of the recommendations, was to increase the rate of sort of valuation, or sort of how often the frequency of valuation, how often that was happening. I think the next cycle is happening quite soon, so anyone who owns some commercial property can look forward to that process happening. Yeah, that's I think it's happening. I think it's ongoing at the moment.
Yeah. I think yeah. So just to recap, Scotland has primarily non-domestic rates and council tax as a way to tax land and property, and I guess this is why we need to think about other mechanisms and options that are within the devolved space, and to do more with the current system, which is where this work comes in.
Well, that certainly sets a precedent, doesn't it? If commercial property is being valued every 3 years and there's a cycle, it makes natural sense to move this to the domestic space, which you say is fairly consistent across the other countries. So let's just touch on that one first then. Looking at these other 4 countries, do any of them go back to before a lot of people were born to value homes, or is Scotland and the rest of the UK as well, let's not forget that, are we a fairly strong outlier in that?
Yes, we are, quite considerably. The other 4 places we looked at do this on a primarily annual basis. So most states in Australia do this annually. The Netherlands does this annually. There's one state in Australia that I think it's every 3 years. Denmark's every 2 years, and then in South Africa you can have up to 5 years, and there's sort of slight tweaks for commercial and sort of residential property there, but most places also have the same sort of cycle for all property types. There's no sort of difference there too. So, but yes, we are a massive sort of outlier in terms of how often. And I think on our framework, that's the one where there's the largest sort of gap on the sort of scale that we use between where Scotland's placed and where the other 4 are placed. So yeah.
I'm going to bring that image up, and for those who are listening to the audio recording, we'll have a link in the show notes, but I want you to see what that looks like, because often when I write reports like this as well, Matt, and you've written 63 pages, basically all you needed was that little chat to show how far Scotland is to one side. Another area I wanted to pick up on was the environmental consideration. And that's something that Cathy had said is becoming of increasing importance. So to summarise, what we're saying is some countries look at land and how it could be used, and depending on how it can be used, they might put the valuation of the land up or they might put it down. Could you talk to that from the other 4 countries and then talk about what we do in Scotland to consider the environmental impact of land use?
I'll actually start with the reverse, because it's quite simple. We don't, or Scotland doesn't, and neither does the UK. It's not a consideration at all in the valuation process. That's not necessarily unique. It's probably sort of unique in its sort of complete sort of nonness, but I think it's an increasing sort of issue that sort of lots of places are sort of grappling in. In the other 4 places we looked at, it sort of is being factored in sort of some way. Consideration in Denmark and Australia is quite explicit. In Denmark, it's incredibly complicated. They look at sort of everything from sort of natural resources to man-made, and it's sort of how close you are to them and within certain bounds determines valuation. It's incredibly complicated, and this is obviously why they have this sort of automated sort of system. Similarly, in Australia. in the Netherlands and South Africa, it's slightly more sort of indirect. It sort of shapes the valuation process, if that sort of makes sense. Sort of those sort of a broad consideration, or it's indirect in the sense that sort of it sets sort of certain exemptions. Specifically in sort of South Africa, there are sort of certain things that sort of aren't included in that sort of done on sort of looking at sort of natural resources, specifically mining here is sort of what I'm thinking of. But
okay.
In Scotland, it doesn't really, it doesn't factor at all. The main issue with, I think, considering the natural environment is that most valuation processes are done market-based in some way, and providing a market valuation of natural resources is quite hard. And this is probably where tech can help, and probably why sort of Denmark has moved sort of further ahead than others, I'd say, into this space, sort of given its movement to more sort of automated processes, and sort of using quite sort of snazzy sort of tools in sort of a lot of ways as well. So yeah.
I think this is an area, and I know that your report doesn't really go into this, Matt, but I think this is an area that highlights the importance of land use planning as well within this context, and understanding sort of designated land use, sort of productive potential, and how that drives land values, and then therefore what role tax can play in supporting that goal of meeting that land use, whether it's regeneration, housing, or nature restoration. I think that's quite an important thing to think about when we're thinking about next steps.
Mm-hmm. Cathy, specifically, the Scottish Land Commission believes that tax on land and property should play a more significant role in supporting a just transition to net zero and a more equitable economy. I think I've cut and pasted that from your website, so I'm pretty sure that's correct. But could you talk to this report and the valuation of land and say, well, how does that align if we look at a different way to value and a different way to tax land? How does that lead into a just transition, net zero, and a more equitable economy?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Previous advice from the Commission on how tax can play a role in supporting land reform outcomes was that there are different things you can do with tax, like hypothecation, so ring fencing that and supporting communities and local government in a different way. So I think there is an interesting model to look at there. I also think that there are uplifts created from investment in land and land use change, where tax could play quite an important role. I think let's just going back to the basics of some of the theoreticals around taxing land more effectively, is that taxing land it's an efficient approach to taxation. It's fixed. It can encourage land to be used more productively. So going back to that point about behaviour change and using it to deliver certain land outcomes that can support a just transition. So what are we prioritising? But also land is really attractive to tax because it cannot be moved. So it's difficult to avoid, to evade. So I think all of this actually combined creates a really important opportunity for Scotland to think about how tax can support just transition outcomes, but also how it can create a really efficient system of taxation where benefits can be shared more equitably.
Primarily, we're looking at, and this is primarily and generally to an extent, but we're looking at increasing taxation of land because it tends to be the wealthiest people in society who own land. So increasing the taxation on land is likely to reduce income and wealth inequality. And for me, that talks to a value. And in your report, you talk about the purpose of taxation, which I think, and I've got a quote here, and the purpose is really important. And you say here, successful valuation systems are clear on their purpose. And it's this purpose, along with political considerations, that shape the choices made over the key ways valuations can be approached. And I agree completely. But I think it's important to also have values. And the value, I think, that needs to be made really clear is that land should be taxed fairly as a way to reduce inequality, and the inequality is socially harmful. And I think we need to be much more powerful in our presentation of this, that this is the reason why we're taxing, because it's about redistribution or pre-distribution, depending on how you look at it. But it is from a value basis that we need to be much more progressive in tax, and we have to tax the wealth of the richest in society. Now, that's a fairly kind of political statement, but do you think the report talks to that, or do you think it's more neutral than?
I think the very fact that we're looking at this suggests that we're on a path to thinking about what role tax can play, and I think definitely a conversation about values is a key part of that, which is why that public engagement piece is very important. I mean, as we say, the Commission thinks that land and tax needs to be thought about more. We have looked at international approaches to land value taxation and whether that would work in Scotland, and I think just taking it right back to basics. So if we do want to get there, and we need to determine what there looks like, that destination, we need to think about the sort of a practical route map to help Scottish Government deliver. And this is where this report comes in.
Yeah, of course, we try to be as neutral as possible. We've tried to see this as sort of, evidence-led evidence-led sort of analysis, but obviously you can't escape sort of what the ultimate purpose of sort of valuation is primarily for, which is for the purpose of taxation. In most places we looked at, this is obviously a relatively broad tax that's applied, so you can get kind of wider public sort of purchase for, I guess, things you're doing. So I guess that's sort of a different way to look at it. You have you can sort of generate a relatively broad tax base through property, and it's also then who gets to use this. Like a lot of these countries are a lot more decentralized than us. It's sort of led by municipalities, both the valuation process and then ultimately sort of setting sort of tax rates. So it gives sort of local communities and sort of local sort of actors more control over sort of what they're doing, the tax they have, and sort of how they then sort of choose to use it as well. So I think there are important sort of considerations sort of there, sort of whether this is a nationally collected tax or a locally collected tax, and there's variation there too, and that has a massive outcome on sort of use.
It's interesting. Again, you didn't touch on that understandably in the report, but certainly there's an argument for national taxation because it stops this kind of race to the bottom, and it stops. Whereas local taxation is quite good because people are able to decide what they want, but it does endanger a position where you're looking at land and you're trying to earn as much money from it as possible, or use it completely differently. So that is really interesting. One point that I wasn't sure about in the report was there was a line that said that the valuation processes should be independent. I just wondered, independent from what and why and how?
Yeah, of course. So we had sort of a number of interviews with sort of those who take part in the valuation process, or sort of monitor the valuation process in the countries we looked at, and they stressed it was really important that these weren't sort of the decisions that were made by politicians, either locally or sort of nationally. This was a purely sort of independent process that was sort of overseen by arms length organizations, or sort of carried out by sort of experts and assessors. So I think it's the interference in the process of valuing, because the ultimate end purpose is made by sort of in policy circles. So it's for them to make sort of choices on what tax rates are, what it's used for. That's obviously their gift. But I think it's important that the information that's informing those it was stressed that the information that's informing those, i.e. the valuation, is drawn as independently as is possible. And that seemed broadly sensible, that those two systems are sort of separate, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a huge assumption that the market value is not there's no interference in the market system, and that's where I think I'm kind of questioning it. They're saying, well, politicians aren't interfering in the value, we're leaving it to the market. The market's not some kind of isolated, powerless vehicle. So I think it's really important that the valuation process does have a political engagement and involvement. So that's why I'm questioning that independence, because it's not independent. If you leave something to the market, it's as far from being independent as you can possibly imagine. And so that's the point I'd like to draw out.
Yeah, there is I think there is a recognition of this. The market can sort of only go so far. And I think even sort of working out market value, I think the important word in sort of the international sort of definition that's broadly used is it's an estimation. And I think that estimation obviously brings with it sort of natural uncertainty. It's not, this isn't sort of meant to be perfect. But broadly speaking, that's probably fair for most sort of residential and commercial property. It gives some sense of sort of understanding. People sort of understand broad value in that terms, but there are obviously property types that sort of won't apply to, and they have to have sort of different sort of methods applied to them. But more broadly, it's an understanding that sort of those values that sort of come out, there is sort of lots of uncertainty. So for example, in sort of Denmark, you get sort of a 20% sort of discount, for want of a better phrase, on the value. And it's not an increase, it's always a reduction, and that just sort of recognizes that this isn't a perfect system. So there's some sort of intervention there to sort of correct a market sort of valuation in sort of some ways. And sort of as stressed, there's sort of the natural environment, this sort of grappling with these questions of the natural environment. A lot of countries sort of want to include this in valuation, to acknowledge this properly, but they understand that sort of the market-based approaches that dominate aren't best to sort of help this. So it's how do we use sort of other tools, either sort of technology or sort of other interventions that can sort of help to sort of accurately reflect. So yeah, I think it's using it as a base for most, but then sort of realizing where there are those sort of important considerations that have to be acknowledged. And yeah,
I'm certainly concerned that we're leaving this too much to the market to decide what the value is. And Kathy, I definitely want you to come in, but it is that you're looking at land, and for some reason we're forced to put a financial value of something that it's impossible to value financially, because of what these natural resources do. So I just wonder, how does the Scottish Land Commission kind of approach that? Because this is a fairly kind of theoretical discussion, how we're valuing something that's inherently essential and impossible to actually value. How do we kind of square those difficulties?
Yeah, I was just going to zoom out for a second and actually trying to articulate what is the role of tax. Like, where do we use sticks and carrots to deliver our environmental aims and objectives, but also where do we use other fiscal mechanisms? What's the role of subsidies? What's the relationship with planning? So I think actually you need to think about the tax system in the round, and it has a very specific role. Tax needs to be well designed, targeted, and be purposeful, as you said earlier. But we also need to consider the other levers that Scottish Government has to deliver on nature restoration. And there's lots of discussions about what we prioritise and how you value nature, for example. But I think it's important to bear in mind that this is just one specific mechanism that can help us achieve our outcomes.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's look at the policies. So we've got this wonderful bit of work. I know neither of you are policy makers, although Kathy, you're heavily influencing. But if you just take a step back and say, what's the natural policies that come out of this? So Matt, to assure you, I'm not asking you for a political judgment here. Okay, but if you were to read this report as a layperson, what do you think the natural kind of policies that would come out of this would?
So I think we specifically, and it might seem that it's just sort of a language choice, but I think we thought it was important. The report doesn't really conclude with sort of recommendations. We sort of call it sort of lessons. It's sort of what can we draw from sort of what, like, those sort of countries we sort of looked at, and we thought that was probably important because it provides sort of a broader sort of scope of sort of things to look in. And there's sort of 9 lessons, which is obviously a perfect number to have. There's 9 lessons which sort of cover things from the big sort of structural things and sort of the nuts and bolts all the way down to quite sort of specific issues around sort of role of tech, role of private sector assessors, sort of how you and consider sort of natural environments, drawing on obviously sort of those sort of commonalities and sort of good practice that we see, that leave scope for recommendations probably to be made in sort of a wide sort of number of ways, I think. So I think that's sort of quite good in sort of how we sort of frame those around sort of lessons and yeah, that sort of broadness through to relatively specific areas to draw on. Yeah, I think the framework is, as you said, the visual of the framework shows how different Scotland is in many ways, which show that there are probably areas and if it's not just Scotland, it's also the wider UK, can draw from how others are doing things. I think specifically on issues of revaluation and role of oversight sort of organisations, that's sort of quite novel in the way we do things there, and there's probably
and the environmental aspect as well.
Yeah, of course, yes, yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So I think it's a bit too early in the process to draw any firm recommendations and advice to ministers, and you'll have to wait a little bit longer. We're hoping to publish our advice in the springtime, so this would be looking at options for carbon land taxation, as well as where we are with this wider longer term piece of work, understanding the role of land and tax in supporting multiple outcomes. But I think what this report does highlight is the importance of up-to-date data, land data, sort of a more coordinated approach to data, bringing together ownership, use, value. So there's lots that we can learn there. And actually that, again, relates to our previous work. But also there's something really important about bringing people along with you and building a trusted system. And I think that's quite clear from this report. And again, that's something we've said previously. So I'm afraid for any policy advice, we'll have to wait till the spring.
So here's the chart that's in your report that just shows how much of an outlier Scotland is in these 6 areas. And Scotland's the pink, isn't it? Far on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
Denmark orange on the right. So I definitely do think it's a really good report. But when you look at this, you can kind of start to see that we probably should be doing things different. And it'll be really interesting to see what that different policy those different policies are when the Scottish Land Commission does get round to publishing its advice for ministers. Well, thank you very much both. I really enjoyed the paper. I do encourage everyone to read it. I said it's interesting, especially when we're looking at some of the countries that we kind of often aspire to in terms of taxation. So thank you very much both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation. And for me, the biggest takeaway is that we finally seem to be taking this issue of land taxation seriously. I mean, when we're talking about the commercial property being valued every 3 years, but residential property not being valued since 1991, I think we've got a clear indication that we can start to look at council tax very differently. But I think it's really important that we do separate the value of the property and the value of land. I think that would be a big step for the Scottish Government to take. Now, it's also really important to talk about the framing of the conversation we've just had around taxation, because Cathy, a couple of times, which was great to hear, was talking about taxation as a way to change people's behaviour. And at the UK level, we know that taxation doesn't fund government spending, and taxation should be all about changing people's behaviour. Whereas in Scotland, because the Scottish Government is a currency user and not a currency issuer, it needs tax revenue, but that tax revenue has to come from the Scottish private domestic sector. So we really need to be conscious that when we're taking money from the Scottish private domestic sector and we're spending it, that we're taking it from the right people, because the money is circulating in the economy. So it's really important to just draw that distinction between tax as a way to change people's behaviour and raise revenue in Scotland. But because the government is not resource constrained and needed tax money to spend, we really need to be focusing on tax at the UK level to change people's behaviour. And there's certainly no better way of using tax than to tax land much more fairly, much more proportionally. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scotonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scotonomics. Also, please do like, share and comment on this podcast.